Throughout World War II, there were many different traitors who betrayed their countries and sided for the enemy, becoming a spy. The Germans even utilised teenagers to spy upon their enemies, and at the end of the conflict there were a number of them shot by the Americans after they were discovered behind their lines, keeping a close watch on their movements. Albert Pierrepoint, the experienced British hangman, would during the war perform the executions of traitors such as Lord Haw William Joyce, who broadcasted propaganda for the Nazis, and also John Amery, a man who dreamed of creating a legion of British soldiers fighting for the Nazis. But most of the executions that were carried out during the time of war were incredibly quiet, and they were kept secret as to not damage the morale of the British. One of the lesser-known traitors was George Armstrong, who was one of only 3 British subjects who were executed during the war. But what happened to him, and why was he condemned? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. George Johnson Armstrong was born in 1902, and he is remembered in history as the first British citizen to be executed under the Treachery Act. Armstrong was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and he was also an engineer by trade. Before the Second World War broke out, Armstrong claimed that he had met a German named Dr. Karl Klein at the Nautical Club in London, and someone informed Armstrong that this man was in fact a German agent. But after the war broke out and the British declared war upon the Germans, Armstrong travelled to America, specifically New York, and he stayed inside the Chelsea Hotel. He remained in New York for 2 weeks and frequented different bars, and in one of them, which was being run by an Irishman, he met a German woman named Alice Hahn. But when he was speaking to her one day, Dr. Klein, this mysterious figure, appeared in the bar. Klein had a chat with the woman, and Armstrong said she was very friendly with some merchant naval officers. But Armstrong noticed that Alice Hahn had a habit of becoming close to these men, probably to find out information about convoys which were travelling between New York and Britain. She grew close also to Armstrong, and he was taken to a bar on Broadway, along with many other merchant naval officers and a number of other women. They all drank and got heavily intoxicated, and they did answer questions about convoy movements. Later in July 1940, Armstrong went to Boston, and whilst here he was arrested by immigration authorities. Inside of a camp he met up again with Karl Klein, and they were both inmates together. Klein said his wife had been arrested, and that she was charged with being a German agent. Klein said there would be other actions against German doctors who were accused of being spies, but Armstrong and Klein became close friends. Klein had placed a Nazi undercover agents in the UK, and Armstrong claimed that Klein admitted he was too a spy. But he said he hadn't done any spying in America, but Armstrong said that he thought there was a ring of German agents working in America, and that he was not part of the spy ring who were attempting to find out information about the British convoy system. The FBI became involved in this, and Armstrong was implicated in it. He was given letters containing important military information, and whilst Klein had been away, Armstrong looked at a number of his letters, and he read about the agents working undercover in the UK. Because of his links to the spy ring, George Johnson Armstrong was then deported from America and was sent back to England. Of course this was incredibly dangerous, and he knew that the evidence was piled against him, and that he had been linked to giving away information and intelligence specifically about shipping. The circumstances of this was that U-boats could have targeted the shipping and brought havoc, especially to merchant naval vessels and boats carrying important supplies. When he arrived back to England, he was arrested by the authorities and was then locked up in prison. Upon his arrest, he gave a statement and claimed, "My interest is, and has been solely from a merchant navy point of view. It is with this purpose in mind at all times that I have jeopardised my own security to produce some concrete evidence that would lead me to an investigation of the officials concerned and the apprehension of the agents who used the information so procured. It is my sincere hope that responsible officials in England will be interested in repairing this condition and thereby giving such members of the British Merchant Navy who are willing and anxious to bring these ships and cargoes to England at least a 50-50 chance of survival, at all events closing off this source of information and sabotage." He was charged with violating the Treachery Act 1940, and this specific piece of legislation said that if with the intent to help the enemy any person does or attempts or conspires with any person to do any act which is designed or likely to give assistance to the naval, military, or air operations of the enemy, to impede such operations of His Majesty's forces, or to endanger life, he shall be guilty of felony, and shall on conviction suffer death. There was no other punishment for those who were charged and convicted with treason during the war than death, and they were then executed. There were only a few men condemned by this, and for this offence in Britain during the war, George Armstrong would become the first. George Armstrong was, on the 8th of May 1941, tried as mentioned by the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey in London. It was claimed about his actions that, on or about the 19th of November 1940, being a British subject in the USA, with intent to help the enemy, did an act designed or likely to give assistance to the naval, military or air operations of the enemy, or to endanger life, to with did write and endeavour to send a letter to Dr. Herbert Scholz, German consul at Boston, Massachusetts, offering his services, information and assistance to said Dr. Herbert Scholz. Armstrong provided a statement for the Metropolitan Police, and he stated that despite drinking with those who had been part of the spy ring, he never gave over information, and had admitted he was not a German spy. He was charged with communicating with the German consul, who would help him find out about shipping movements, and it was also claimed that they offered him assistance before the Americans entered the war. Because of the evidence that was piled against him and the links to other spies, George Armstrong was sentenced to death by Mr. Justice Lewis, who passed the first death sentence against a British citizen during the Second World War under the Treachery Act. This was of course kept a secret at the time because of the concerns that the authorities had about a British citizen betraying the nation, and they thought this would demoralise the population and would cause a huge amount of problems and lead to the British becoming rather defeatist. Armstrong was sent to Wandsworth Prison, and he was locked up inside the condemned cell for some time. He did try to appeal, but this was dismissed, and on the 10th of July 1941, George Armstrong was taken from his prison cell into the execution chamber next door, early in the morning. In the days before, he had met with the British executioner, Thomas Pierrepoint, the uncle of Albert Pierrepoint. Thomas Pierrepoint was a very experienced hangman, and he would throughout his time carry out 294 hangings. He would during the war act as an executioner for 13 American soldiers who were condemned at Shepton Mallet Military Prison. At the time there was a concern about his fitness for the job of hanging, as in 1940 he was called into question regarding the fact that he strongly smelled of drink and had poor eyesight. Armstrong was taken into the execution chamber and he was shuffled over the trapdoor. Pierrepoint secured the noose around his neck after he had a black cap placed over his head. Within a few minutes it was all over, as George Armstrong was sent crashing through the trapdoor, and with this he was left for some time, until death was confirmed by a doctor, and he was cut down. George Johnson Armstrong was the first British citizen to have been executed under the Treachery Act 1940, and he was one of 4 others who were condemned under it. His reasons for spying are not the clearest. He was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but of course these were enemies of the Nazis. It's most probable that he was seduced into the world of spying by the German women who frequented the nightclubs and bars in America where he was based, and with this was then linked to the spy ring. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.